It's my pleasure to lead engagement efforts for the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, and if you do have questions that are lingering after this webinar, you can also reach out to me. I've posted an email address on the slide here. On the title slide, it's noaa.toolkit@noaa.gov to reach our team, and any email that goes to that goes to our whole team, and we're very responsive to questions and interest in our efforts. So I encourage folks to please do go ahead and be in touch with us, because we're interested in your feedback. So thank you, Jack, for the opportunity to reach out to your very large audience of folks. My understanding is that most of the people on this call are inside the federal government working on resilience efforts spanning many, many sectors and disciplines. And today we're going to focus on the Climate Resilience Toolkit effort, which is an outgrowth of the President's Climate Action Plan from 2013. And we built this toolkit website a year and a half ago and have been innovating it ever since, with the aim of helping people learn from and enact their own climate resilience projects by taking tools and data and putting it in context of the specific interests and needs that they have. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the toolkit, but that is something that I do for people on a regular basis. And if you have specific interest in how to use the toolkit, go to toolkit.climate.gov. And if you have any questions whatsoever, don't hesitate to reach out. Happy to lead people through and give them a deeper understanding of the content that we have. But I do want you to know that we do have theme teams in distinct topic areas that come from many, many government agencies, so that we can absorb the expertise and interest that you collectively have. And there is a pathway for you to submit your ideas through the toolkit, through the team structure. We also have templates for submitting stories and tools. If you have resources that you feel should be featured through the toolkit, we're very interested in hearing from you, and I can provide you those templates through an email exchange. They're also available through the listserv and so forth. We also do engagement, where we teach people how to use the toolkit in the context of their own sector. We do webinars, we do live events, and I'm happy to say that the speakers we have here today represent a really good cross-section of the ways the toolkit is being used on the ground today in the United States, throughout the country. So I'm reserving most of the time to hand this presentation off to four fantastic people. We're going to first hear from Kelly Harper from the Cape Cod Commission. She's an early adopter of the toolkit. She's been giving us feedback since the very beginning, before it was even published, and is continuing to provide feedback as we innovate the design and what we present. She's also been using the steps to resilience in her own work. Dan Krieger is going to speak to us about his efforts to bring this work into the private sector and provide accreditation and training to people in different walks of life so that they can be accredited climate change officers. Rachel Jacobson has been coordinating the VISTA, the Resilience AmeriCorps program, among other things, and has been helping us understand how to help our nation's leading-edge thinkers who are volunteering their time early in their career to help communities use climate information in their resilience building. And anchoring our program will be Jim Fox, who's a co-architect of this site. He's here in Asheville, North Carolina, where I live, and he heads up the UNC Asheville National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center. And in addition to helping with the thought behind and the design and the implementation of this toolkit, he's been using this process in consultations He's going to talk specifically about some recent work he's doing in the city of Asheville, which, by the way, is the picture in the background on my title screen. That's Asheville from the air. You can see where we live. And with that, I'd like to hand over the presentation to Callie.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for this opportunity to present and to share information about some of our resiliency projects that we've been working on Cape Cod. So this is an image of Cape Cod that's taken from space. I love this image because you can really see that the Cape is a peninsula off the coast of Massachusetts, and we basically stick out into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and we're surrounded almost 100% by water. So we're really, we're unique to other areas of Massachusetts because all 15 of our towns have a pretty extensive coastline. So this geography means that we're vulnerable to flooding, sea level rise, and erosion. We also have data and history to back up that vulnerability. So as a region, we have over 13,000 single-family homes in the special flood hazard area, so A and B zones on the FEMA maps. And dating back to the 1960s, nearly 93% of our property damage on the Cape from natural hazards comes from coastal storms. One significant storm that affected the Cape in the early 90s was Hurricane Bob, which caused about $300 million worth in property damage. So as a coastal community, our transportation infrastructure like roads and culverts and bridges are at risk. So one example of this vulnerability is Ballston Beach in Truro, Mass., which is right at the tip of Cape Cod. So years of erosion and storm surge events has caused this bluff that you can see here in the image to migrate inland, which basically rendered the northern extension of that road, isolated that northern extension of that road from the southern extension. And it also dumped quite a bit of sand on the municipal parking lot that you see in the sort of bottom middle, and that is a major revenue source for the town. So we've been tracking these vulnerabilities for years, and as a community, we're ready to take action and build a more resilient Cape Cod. So how do we go about doing that? How do we build a more resilient Cape Cod? Well, that's when we're relying on guidance from the Climate Resilience Toolkit. So steps 1 and 2 in the toolkit are really to explore climate threats and assess vulnerability and risk by engaging others and gathering data on trends and threats. But in order for us to get to these last 3 steps of options and prioritization and action, we had to be really clear and precise and specific about the climate science and also the asset vulnerability. So to do this, we used our data from several federal agencies like NOAA and the Department of Transportation and FEMA, and developed our own online innovative tools to assess our vulnerabilities at the local level. So this is one of the tools that we created at the Commission. We call it the Chronology Viewer. It shows how the coastline and development on the coast changes over time. So it takes a real qualitative look at how transportation assets that are fixed to the land and really expensive to move and repair have either disappeared completely or have been retreated. So this is a snapshot of the tool. The user can turn on the aerial maps of Cape Cod taken by USGS from different time periods by moving that vertical slider and see how the coastal infrastructure has changed over time. What's really neat about this tool is that USGS often flew these aerial surveys after large storms, so we were able to capture aerial images of the Cape after hurricanes in 1930, in the 50s, and then also in the early 90s. We also developed our own sea level rise viewer at the Cape Cod Commission. This is also a really great tool that we use in our transportation work, and the user can basically raise the level of the sea, and the online map will show how much the Cape will be inundated with water. A really interesting feature about this tool are the red lines that you see. These are the disconnected roads, so that's the transportation infrastructure that's no longer in service because of that rising water. So the tool also allows the viewer to turn on the FEMA flood maps and also the slosh models and look at the inundation pathways when all 3 of those data sets are turned on. So we use both of these tools, that chronology viewer and the sea level rise viewer, extensively in our vulnerability assessments for regional transportation infrastructure. And the toolkit really gave us the framework for how to overlap the science data with the infrastructure vulnerability. But the toolkit also helped us with a framework for engaging with others and learning from other organizations. Because really to build a resilient transportation system, we relied heavily on guidance and ranking tools from the U.S. Department of Transportation. We're also really eager to continue our collaboration with the state of Massachusetts to learn about their dynamic sea level rise tool that they've been working on for a couple years. And they're also about to kick off a project where they're forecasting shoreline change in 30-year intervals. But really the best part of the transportation work that I've been doing over the last couple of years has been the learning process that we're going through with the actual towns on Cape Cod. So for nearly 2 years, we've been working with the Department of Public Works directors in our towns because those are really the individuals that are on the front lines. They're the ones who go out and they fix the assets when they're inundated with flooding, or they retreat roads in high erosion areas. So the toolkit really helped formalize this local outreach process and gave us a path forward for how to become more resilient. And I'd just like to thank you guys, and a special thank you to our funding agencies, which are located on the bottom there of the slide.
Fantastic, Callie. So I just invite people to make a note of their questions and use the chat window. If you want to enter them now, that's fine. I'll read back through the chat at the end of this call and make sure we address questions as time allows. And I'd like to hand the mic over to Dan Krieger at this point from the Association of Climate Change Officers.
Great, thanks, Ned. Appreciate it. Well, it's great to follow up with on Callie, who's actually participated in some of what I'm going to be talking about. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Association of Climate Change Officers, you might think of us as being a professional association or society for engineers or architects, except our members are people who are core members or people who are tasked with leading climate change initiatives in their organizations, whether they're the public or private sector. But we're also integrating climate change into other professional functions. So next slide. So some basic assumptions here that kind of are foundation to where we are and what we're doing. So we need to have dependable and safe infrastructure, ability to be mobile, access to resources, public health, job opportunity, security. We'd all agree on these things, right? The devil's in the details as to how to make sure these things happen with a dynamically changing world. Next slide. So the challenge here that we see is a human capital human capital lens. So, we're looking at how decisions get made and how those decisions get made at the intersection of climate change considerations. So how do we balance today with tomorrow? How do we avoid being too episodic? How do we deal with changing leadership and a workforce that frankly hasn't been trained to deal with these issues? Next slide. At the end of the day, we're talking about substantial transformation of how our cities are designed, how our communities are built, but also how our businesses function, how we govern. That's a public will issue, but excitement doesn't breed capacity. Next slide. For us, we see human capital as being the key to it all. And so a few years ago, we started building what we call the core competencies for climate change officers and professionals, which you can reference on the ACO website. You can see them bucketed on foundational knowledge and skills, organizational knowledge and experience, and what you do with it, the strategic execution competencies. This will all play in momentarily when we start talking about how we start achieving getting this human capital. We launched a credentialing program aligned with this called the CCO certification and CCP designations, the CCO being the leadership function in an organization, the CCP being a practitioner, and ultimately the practitioner level function will have different credentials tailored by different professional functions. So what you would need to know as a civil engineer would be different than what you would need to know as an energy manager or a supply chain professional or a public health professional. Next slide. So as you start thinking about this in the context of our own professions, there's also the integration of these skills and the corresponding competencies into other professional organizations. So we're already having conversations and collaborating with groups like the American Planning Association, the Institute for Supply Management, the American Institute of Architects, and some of these others are organizations that are on our short list to reach out to start collaborating with over the next year. Next slide. So for us, we think about starting to break down what the key elements to successful climate action are, and you'll see a big red arrow next to education and training. We see this as being the linchpin to everything. Next slide. So we started building a catalog of curriculum to meet those objectives. And you'll see that we have it almost bucketed looking like a university catalog. And if you look all the way to the left, you'll see our climate dash courses, starting with understanding climate science and the latest projections, moving on towards, as you get down, being able to conduct vulnerability assessments and leveraging climate data and tools. This is where our collaboration with NOAA and the NOAA Climate Program Office really started to kick off. Next slide. So as we started putting these courses together, we were shaping course descriptions and learning objectives, and the Climate Program Office played a key role in helping us shape these courses. So one of the courses is our Climate 101 course, also our Climate 102, which teaches people, next slide, to understand climate variability, extreme events, and long-term climate change and the distinction between them. To then ultimately being able to teach them how to go about leveraging climate data and tools that are available to inform their decision making. We went through this process, next slide, by putting a committee of experts for each course together. And this is an example of the team of folks who contributed to the Climate 101, many of whom I'm sure you'll know. To the next image. And then we started making these available. And so for the last 2.5 years, Dave Herring, Ned Gardner, and the rest of the team there at NOAA Climate Program Office have been a key part in helping us deliver the components of these courses that are in their wheelhouse. And so you'll see a lineup of our upcoming live boot camps online that we currently offer. And then we also started looking at how this experience working together could serve to inform future iterations of the toolkit. So here you'll see a webinar that we did in April where Dave presented the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, and as they were contemplating what 2.0 the toolkit would look like, we actually did a subsequent invite for people who participated in this to do a more hands-on interactive session with Dave and his team. Go ahead to the next slide. So as we're thinking about this, we think about what the last 30 or 40 years of climate change conversations have looked like. It's been 2 degrees Celsius, 3 feet of sea level rise. That's not actionable decision making. This toolkit starts to get to actionable decision making, but it needs to also be informed by how practitioners use it. So the collaboration between ACO and NOAA here has been fantastic because we're getting to understand how we can use, our community can get to understand how to use the toolkit in its current design and manifestation. Then they get the opportunity to collaborate through us on that, but through that process they can then serve to think about what version 3.0 of that toolkit looks like. Now as we come back to the Fed, the relationship with the Fed here is really important. We envision a profession of climate change leaders. We envision a climate savvy or smart workforce. If you look at EO 13693 sections 11A and 11B, that language is there. We've been doing this for 7-8 years now, and it's actually now in your executive order. So this collaboration between ACO and NOAA is really playing a key role for catalyzing this workforce transformation that we're driving towards. Go ahead, next slide. So what we're building together here is championing professional competencies. We're ultimately developing best practices and becoming a guardian to it. We're collaborating with other organizations that have an interest in this. We're developing portals for education and training and standardizing it. We have developed a credential that will be the gold standard for hiring decisions. And creating a community that can exchange practices and experiences to help one another to shortcut a lot of the time that's being spent to deal with these challenges, and of course becoming an incubator for cutting-edge solutions. Next slide. So with that, I'll wrap, but the collaboration here, the opportunity to bring communities of practice who don't have exposure to these tools with the folks who generate and maintain these tools creates a really important life cycle of getting good resources out to inform decision making, but to then ensure that future generations of these tools are meeting the practitioner needs.
Thanks so much, Dan. That was fantastic. And I'll see you next week in Colorado for our next Climate Fundamentals Academy.
Yep.
So I'd like to turn the mic over to Rachel, who you'll remember is VISTA Training Coordinator.
Hi, everyone. This is Rachel Jacobson. I'm the VISTA Training Coordinator on contract to NOAA's Office for Coastal Management and the Corporation for National and Community Service. So Resilience AmeriCorps, like the Climate Resilience Toolkit, comes from the President's Climate Action Plan, and it responds directly to a recommendation by the President's State, Local, and Tribal Leaders Task Force on Climate Preparedness and Resilience to enhance our commitments to building resilience in vulnerable communities that are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change. And the way we do that is by recruiting and training AmeriCorps VISTA members to serve low-income communities across the country. And these members are developing plans and implementing projects that increase resilience building capacity. So here on this map, you can see in red are 28 current Resilience AmeriCorps sites. Each of these sites has an AmeriCorps VISTA member or multiple AmeriCorps VISTA members serving in either a local jurisdiction, a state agency, or a community-based organization. And then locations that you can see on this map in blue are tribal sites. Those sites are going to be coming online between now and mid-next calendar year, working with tribal housing authorities and tribal colleges and universities for a total of around 83 sites across the country. And just to give you a sense of the types of activities that Resilience AmeriCorps members conduct, so they do things like identifying and mapping community assets, assessing the resilience needs specifically of low-income populations in their community, conducting community outreach to those residents and ensuring their needs are met and incorporated into resilience planning and resilience projects, and then really strengthening linkages between the various organizations that are engaged in resilience work. Next slide. So robust training and technical assistance really is a hallmark of Resilience AmeriCorps, and the program was designed in such a way to deploy the federal government's climate data and information and tools directly to local communities. And the Resilience AmeriCorps members and the communities in which they serve also have mechanisms through which they provide feedback on those assets to improve their usability and their accessibility. So our training and technical assistance program includes a 2-day in-person training, the Resilience AmeriCorps Academy, and during that training we hold a federal resource fair. Many federal agencies, perhaps some of you even on the call today, have probably participated in our resource fair. And of course representatives from NOAA and from the Climate Resilience Toolkit program team participate as well. So this resource fair is really the first opportunity that Resilience AmeriCorps members and their supervisors have to learn about the Climate Resilience Toolkit. So that's like a 25-minute hands-on demonstration and just gives a little taste of what the toolkit provides. That toolkit table is always really popular at the fair, and the members and supervisors are eager to learn more. And so then the next opportunity they have to engage with the toolkit is a 2-part webinar series. And this is focused on specifically the needs of the Resilience AmeriCorps members, but it's also open to their supervisors and community members, or members in their organization rather. And through that 2-part series, they get targeted exposure to the toolkit's functions and its content, and opportunity to practice using it within the context of their own work. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. And then finally, after they participate in that webinar series and they meet the program team, we create some avenues for the team to respond to individual needs. And for the most part, this happens virtually, but it also can happen in person sometimes when the locations align. So next slide. So I'm going to describe our webinars in a little bit more depth, but I also want to mention one other opportunity that is actually open to all AmeriCorps VISTA members, not just the members that are serving under the Resilience AmeriCorps umbrella. And that's our Climate Resilience Toolkit call-out page on the VISTA Campus Resilience pages. So the VISTA Virtual Campus is an online resource platform for all AmeriCorps VISTA members. And the resilience pages highlight resources in 5 areas: economic resilience, infrastructure resilience, disaster resilience, coastal resilience, and of course climate resilience. And the goal is that each page be a jumping off point for AmeriCorps VISTA members to get their feet wet in resilience thinking by exploring 1 or 2 targeted federal resilience resources. So the Climate Resilience Toolkit has an expanded page that's linked from the Climate Resilience section, and it introduces users to the toolkit. It connects the toolkit with the work that AmeriCorps VISTA members do, which is focused around anti-poverty and capacity building, and it invites them to check it out for themselves. Next slide. So, of course, the Climate Resilience Toolkit and Resilience AmeriCorps have a shared mission of helping communities build resilience. And we've spent a significant amount of time developing a two-part webinar series that's designed to equip Resilience AmeriCorps members who are doing the resilience building work on the ground in communities with the resilience building processes and tools that are available through the CRT. So in our first webinar, a Climate Resilience Toolkit program team member and myself tag team introducing the toolkit. So a toolkit representative introduces the functionality, and I contextualize each function in a way that's relevant to specific Resilience AmeriCorps sites, and then members get the opportunity to try out each function on the toolkit. A toolkit representative gives an introduction to systems thinking and an introduction to the 5-step planning process available on the toolkit. And then I contextualize these tools and ways of thinking within the larger suite of tools and processes that we are introducing to the Resilience AmeriCorps members through other opportunities in our ongoing and training and technical assistance program. And it's about a 1.5-hour webinar, and following that experience, the members apply what they learned in one of 3 ways through follow-up work. So they either develop a conceptual model that's relevant to their community's planning and implementation processes. They complete step 1 of the Climate Resilience Toolkit 5-step planning process that Callie described earlier. So things around identifying threats and assets, identifying stakeholders and goals and objectives for their resilience building work. Or they use a tool or a case study from the toolkit in their work in their community, and they reflect on that. And then in the second webinar, after they've had a chance to explore the toolkit more on their own and complete that learning application work, they present on their work and their findings, and they troubleshoot with the Climate Resilience Toolkit program team about any problems they've run into while using the toolkit, and then they have the opportunity to give some verbal feedback on their experience in using the toolkit. Next slide. So this is just a snapshot of some of the ways in which the Resilience AmeriCorps VISTA members have used the toolkit. So we've now run this 2-part webinar series 1 time, and we're about to run it a second time. In our first iteration, we had 5 members create conceptual models of their Resilience AmeriCorps projects. And one strong piece of feedback that we got was that creating the conceptual models really helps members think about how they would explain their project to less knowledgeable stakeholders. And since stakeholder engagement and community engagement is a huge part of all Resilience AmeriCorps projects, this was really turned out to be a very valuable exercise. And really in learning how to think in systems and how to diagram that was an important skill for our members to learn. There was also a lot of variety in the models that people created, really showing the value of this exercise to people with varying levels of skill and understanding with respect to systems thinking. We had one member use the spreadsheet available on the Climate Resilience Toolkit Steps to Resilience page, and she found that process extremely useful. And by walking through that process with others on our second webinar, she actually inspired others to use it as well, and several people asked to be directed to that link after the webinar so they could explore that on their own. Finally, we had one of our members who reported on a case study that she found on the Climate Resilience Toolkit and an associated tool that was linked to that case study, which is the EPA Stormwater Calculator tool, which she is using to great effect in her work on the ground. This first webinar series also generated some individual, really fruitful follow-up between the Climate Resilience Program team and our sites in Norfolk and Pittsburgh. I also want to mention, just before I wrap up, that we're in the process of implementing some additional feedback mechanisms, particularly to check in with people at the close of their service as they're thinking about transitioning their projects. All of our members serve a one-year term of service, and so continuity and sustainability as that next service member comes in to continue their project is something that's really important, and that the Climate Resilience Toolkit program team is helping us think through how their tools and resources on the toolkit can help with that. Next slide. So I just wanted to sum up with three great pieces of feedback that we received for the Climate Resilience Toolkit through this first webinar series. So the first is, as I mentioned before, that the Climate Resilience Toolkit processes and approach really are useful to people of varying levels of skill and understanding. We had engineers using this systems thinking approach, and we had people with no training in systems thinking using the approach, and both sets of individuals got something out of it. And then introducing Climate Resilience Toolkit resources and processes in a peer-to-peer learning environment, like our webinar series, is proving to potentially increase the uptake of those tools and resources as people share what they found useful with each other. And then finally, the climate resilience case studies really do help people find the tools they need, as evidenced by our members' success in using those case studies to do just that. And finally, I just wanted to mention, one really a useful thing here is that most of our Resilience AmeriCorps VISTA members could be classified as early career professionals in the climate resilience space. Some are working in cities that are really advanced in their resilience thinking, and some are the first people to bring climate resilience thinking to their organizations. I think that the toolkit really has something to offer for all of them. So we look forward to further collaboration.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you for your ongoing work. It's fantastic. Jim, why don't you carry us up to the end, and then I'll have some closing comments. We'll see if we have some questions. There will be some time for discussion, so please make note of your questions if you have them. Jim, take it away.
Well, thanks, Edward, and thanks very much to Callie, Dan, and Rachel. You guys did most of the heavy lifting, so I'm just really going to be more reiterating points that they've made. When we start looking at these steps to the resilience workflow, you can see that step one is really asking the question about, did you know? As Dan talked about, a lot of the education and outreach about really making sure that the key information of climate threats and hazards linking to key assets is, in a discoverable form. But really when we start working with groups and especially communities and companies in step two, we really start getting people to start asking the question about, why should we care? In other words, how does this directly impact me, where I live, where I work, those sorts of issues. And so when you start looking at step two, it's starting to make this more personal. It's no longer just this, interesting conversation. And so vulnerability and risks, especially when they are linked to these key assets, things really people really care about. Great example by Callie of some of the transportation network there on the Cape and how it's being impacted by those coastal storms. And so it's a direct thing that people can actually understand, that's me. And that really leads then to the third big question that we're really trying to get to out of the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit is, what can we do about it? Right? We don't want to be in a situation of, this is just such a huge problem that it's insurmountable and let's give up hope. No, what can we do about it is the important part, and I think you can see the whole focus in the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit is to actually be showing these case studies and how people on the ground are, applying these options. And, not only just kind of developing a laundry list of options, but being able to prioritize those so that if they've got limited resources, they can really start with what's most important and what's going to build the most resilience by lowering the risk. And that will allow them to go to step 5 and take action. So let's go to the next slide and take really a look at how these pieces come together. And I'm so glad, Rachel, that you talked about the importance of complex systems, because, if you start looking at a spaghetti diagram, it's called a conceptual model, but, You know, this is what's kind of happening on the ground in Asheville. And people need to understand the complexity of the system of which they work. And people really understand this, but being able to show it laid out this way and understand that the things in the red boxes are the bottom line assets. These are the things they care about. It's what drives their decisions. And they're really being impacted by these, you know, hazards and threats that are shown in these purple ovals. But note that people are also understanding that climate's only one part of the issue. You know, the climate stressors shown in blue have to be integrated with the non-climate stressors, you know, that are shown in these brown boxes to really be able to understand how the system is working, and that the future change is not just climate change, but things like land use development and economic scenarios and population demographic change. Finally, the important part about this conceptual model is where can you invest? And when you're starting to take action, those are these gray boxes, right? You know, we saw the road improvements that were being made on the Cape, being driven by these impassable roads and the pain point of the road closures. You can see that, you know, these sorts of systems work very well, and this is a simple model for the city of Asheville. But if you can go in and understand that you're really caring about these roads and how they're being impacted by erosion or flooding, then a case study from Cape Cod is very applicable when you start looking at how Cape Cod, you know, took some action to actually remedy those. And so what's really important is, yes, this is a complex system, but let's start just with these asset threat pairs. And so by linking any one of these red boxes to the purple oval that's impacting it, you can actually then start pulling apart this very complex problem into its building blocks. And so as you move on to the next slide in step 2, you really start looking at this vulnerability and risk. And by looking at these individual asset threat pairs, you can understand their susceptibility in pieces. And we really try to talk to people about really two primary concepts. The first one is this exposure. You know, is your asset in harm's way? You know, how does it fit with flooding or landslides or sea level rise or king tides? And, you know, then what is its adaptive capacity? What's the ability to cope with that impact? And if people can really start understanding those two basic pieces, they understand the building blocks behind vulnerability and risk. And it becomes really important for people to be connecting those to these asset threat pairs, because really as we move ahead in the process, they're going to be investing to build resilience to do one of two things. They're going to be either investing to lower their exposure, or they're going to be investing to increase their adaptive capacity. So you move on to step 3 then. That's actually, I think there's another slide, yeah, about step 2 here. No, go ahead to the next slide, that's great. You can see then, though, that these are not just, you know, little concepts. No, these have to be applied on the ground and directly working at the scale that people make their decisions off of. So you can see on the left that these are parcels and structures, and you can see that they're being intersected with the 500-year floodplain from the FEMA data sets. And you can then see that individual parcels and structures are color-coded based on the amount of vulnerability that they're experiencing sitting through there. But if you're looking at the main decision maker moving ahead from maybe an individual property owner to much more likely a city that's investing in taking action at a neighborhood level, then you need to roll that information up from a parcel or structure level to actually these census block groups. And you can see that this is the outline of the city of Asheville and the census block groups. And now you can actually start saying what parts of our town are most vulnerable. You can see this is just for one asset threat pair. This is for residential property as the asset and flooding as the threat. But it allows people to start saying, oh, well, wait a minute, yeah, this is a local problem, that if I start looking at investing in a neighborhood or setting up a policy, that it can be very location-based. So if you go to the next slide, we can then start comparing across all of these asset threat pairs. And it's not just the, you know, the numbers of percentages or parcels that are exposed, which is the beginning concept. But as you start looking at adding that adaptive capacity, really what's most vulnerable. And you can just see from simple means to communicate that a much larger red bar that's in the upper left under commercial properties are showing that, upper right bar, that you're actually seeing many more commercial properties, are vulnerable to flooding than residential properties. And so that allows, the teams within city staff to be concentrating their looking at options on some of their most vulnerable and highest risk assets. So if you go on to the next slide, you can see then that working with workshops, and this is a really key point that both Rachel and Dan made, that people learn best in group settings and from one another in a structured setting. And so we found that being able to use the steps to resilience from the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, but putting it into a workshop environment where people can learn from their peers at the same time they're being led through a structured process is really critical. And so we've just worked, with 10 different cities across the Southeast now, and looking at, how do you look at this information about vulnerability and risk and really tie it into these key assets and services, identify some of these feasible options, and then being able to go to the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit and benchmark against other communities. What are they doing? What are their best practices? And this is just really critical to be allowing communities to talk to one another and learn from themselves and to have that structured process. If you go to the next slide, then you can start prioritizing options. And you can start looking at individual neighborhoods, and these are 2 neighborhoods in Asheville, Royal Pines and Shiloh. And you can see that from these sorts of visualizations, you can see that in one neighborhood, you're going to be more trying to reduce some exposure, while in the other one, you're going to really be trying to increase adaptive capacity. And that means, you just can't say one solution fits all, and you've got the information to actually be able to target the areas, how they need to be targeted and prioritized. So the next slide really shows then a simple way to help people really have that conversation. And it's really a simple red light, green light exercise where if you're looking at all the different options down the left-hand side, there are different categories across the top that you can start saying, okay, for these different options, which ones of these check the boxes? And if you can see something that's going to have green lights all the way across the row, then that's going to be one that rises to the top. It's actually easy to implement, go ahead and get in place. If you start seeing some of these with red lights in any one of the columns, that really gets to be a difficult part about moving ahead. Despite the number of green lights that might be in the other, if there's a red light showing up somewhere, it's probably going to be something the community's not going to be able to put in place. And so it's not just about money, it is about these other factors as well too. So really, what we're trying to do with this U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit is provide people with these step-by-step steps to resilience, what's the best way to do that, but also great ways for them to, look at what other people are doing and to be able to share their experiences with one another as well too.
Thanks, Jim, and I couldn't be more happy with this panel of people. I think this has been a really fantastic set of presentations. It sort of shows the level of maturity with what we're up to, and I'm not seeing any questions in the chat window, although I think Dan wants to chime in with an idea that came to him after he finished speaking. So, Dan, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, Ned. It dawns on me, I talked about the collaboration here serving to inform future development of the toolkit. It also has served to inform how we disseminate training. And as Ned and his team have been working on the 5-step process, we've been thinking about, we've obviously identified a set of core competencies, and we've got a framework for that, and that's a framework that was put together by hundreds of experts with through a public comment process. But how we achieve that is really kind of the key here, and so there's an opportunity here as we're going to continue to make improvements to our dissemination as we seek to standardize when we teach, but also as we're accrediting other institutions to teach. So it's really been a two-way street, and I thought that was important. And I think the other piece is, you know, we've got to work together to get good, actionable information into the hands of decision makers. A lot of risk managers are looking at the sorts of implications from climate change that you know, they can measure already. The actual, you know, the implications: flood, drought, water availability, energy. I mean, they're already looking at these things, but they're not looking at it with a climate lens. And so the integration of the two here is we think about how are we going to make sure that every decision is made intelligently with this in mind. This process, this toolkit, is a great step in that direction, but there's so much more that we all can be doing to coordinate and move that forward.
So often it comes down to understanding the problem of one in a particular discipline. So, for instance, Callie, by really kicking this conversation off focused on transportation, I'm wondering, can you comment on how transportation planners and engineers in general are facing and understanding climate risks? Is this an emerging issue that's well recognized, or do you feel like people are starting to self-organize to address and understand climate issues?
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. We on Cape Cod at the regional level, we have monthly meetings with Mass DOT and Federal Highway, and climate resilience comes up pretty much every meeting. And we have a dedicated line now, funding line from Federal Highway, so that every year we're monitoring and doing vulnerability assessments. And then this year we even got more money to do not just assess what's on the ground, but then follow up with monitoring of those assets. So how are they performing as Department of Public Works starts making changes or goes for grants, and they're able to implement some of the things that they want to do, and how those assets are performing.
Fantastic. I'm not seeing any questions appear in the chat window. If people have questions,
Ned, this is Jack. I know I've gotten some emails that the people had some challenges putting the questions inside the chat room, so there may be questions, and I've told them to email me or you directly, and then you'll get those answered on the post notes.
Well, I'm sorry about the technical problems everyone's experiencing. Can't really do anything about it, but I would say that I'm very much available offline, you know, after this webinar to continue to answer those questions. I do have a question for Dan. One of the things that I see happening, Jim showed a complex, you know, a spaghetti diagram, a systems conceptual model that showed multiple benefits. When we see, or actually Rachel showed one with multiple benefits, and one thing that we find is that when there's multiple benefits to an action or addressing an action, we create room for a conversation that isn't otherwise happening. Say an emergency manager didn't realize that the climate stress on health creates a need for staffing, but by putting together a plan in advance, the city manager can actually save money and improve health for the community, while also, you know, maybe addressing another issue. So, for example, open space and parks provide recreational opportunities, but also remove hazards from floodplains and things like that. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you're seeing the climate conversation that your organization is fostering kind of opening doors and new opportunities for people working across disciplines.
Yeah, so one example that comes to mind is as we were looking at developing the CCP credential for energy management professionals, one of the members of the working group that was helping to shape it was the energy portfolio director at a big manufacturer, and they have a facility in Northern Europe that had been experiencing substantially increased rainfall, and as a result was flooding. And so they've had to install all sorts of industrial water pump equipment to keep the floor of that facility dry. had somebody at that company, or alternatively in that local government, had leveraged a tool like this and forecast, oh shoot, this is a possibility that we need to get their arms around. They could have been sitting around at a table together, and instead of that company having to put this industrial water equipment together, maybe there's a broader community plan for dealing with this increased rainfall, and it would have brought interested stakeholders together. But because that wasn't being mapped out, they were dealing with it afterwards. So the one is there. As you start to map it out, you start to see who's affected, and once you see who's affected, who has skin in the game, who you can bring together, there's a really substantial power in being able to bring uncommon stakeholders together based off of that. So that's one piece. And then the second piece is, and that will be reflected by, we've just been engaged by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. They're looking at infrastructure protection in the 16 critical infrastructure sectors. And they've asked us to to do an assessment as to what the workforce's capability in those sectors is right now to engage in climate preparedness efforts effectively. And if the answer is that they're not, to make recommendations as to what the human capital that can be developed in those sectors can be. And what's going to end up happening as a result of that is it's going to bring Homeland Security together with big energy companies, with water and wastewater facilities, with the defense industrial base. These are all part of critical infrastructure, but also with the government stakeholders at local and national levels, and other communities that intersect with those critical systems. And that's going to facilitate some interesting dialogues amongst risk managers, emergency management, business continuity, environment and sustainability professionals, and public, kind of external affairs oriented folks who don't all sit in a room together very often on these discussions.
Thanks. Are there any other questions on the phone? Rachel, one of the things that I was struck by working with your VISTA volunteers is just how much work is going on the ground. And it was almost, it was sort of very much a reciprocal learning relationship when we started reaching out to do the training for the volunteers. We actually learned a lot about what's happening in the communities. I'm wondering if you've got any insights about that sort of two-way street of learning about what's happening at a community level, and then how we can provide climate information from a national level.
Yeah, thanks, Ned. I mean, I think what's really valuable about deploying climate resilience tools and information through national service projects is that so many national service projects are really developed from the bottom up. A need is identified in a local community, and then there's a bottom-up chain to kind of get a national service member deployed in that community and working on these issues. And so because of that, we're able to, and I know this is something that the Climate Resilience Toolkit, this is really a lens that you all take, which is, you know, what's the niche, what's the angle that's going to bring local leaders, local community members, and just local residents into the climate resilience space, because it's not going to be climate related for everyone. Maybe it's budget related. Maybe it's, you know, what is your need at the local level? And so I think using national service to identify what those needs are and how climate resilience fits in and can really help decrease vulnerabilities and decrease risk is really valuable. And so I think as our program gains traction, and it really will only gain traction if our members are doing well on the ground, and they can only do that if they're well trained, and of course that's where our collaboration comes in. But as the program gains traction, we're going to be able to uncover so many different pockets of need that we may not even know about at the current stage. So I think it's just that process that really helps us get there. And I was just, you know, one highlight on that from our current sites. We have sites through Lutheran Services in America and Catholic Charities USA, which are really vast networks across the country providing general social services to low-income individuals and low-income communities. And so being able to connect up with those service providers and hear from them and also help them understand how climate plays into the services that they're able to provide and the services that they're that the folks they're serving need is, I think, you know, in a lot of ways, kind of an untapped area that we're just starting to get into.
Thanks. We're at the top of the hour, and I didn't get to ask you a last question, Jim, but if you'd like 30 seconds to either answer a question or just where you think this is going. I was wondering for you, what other discipline do you find most often is seeking your help in contextualizing climate information for decision making?
Yeah, thanks, Ned. I think it's very much now the investments for the future. So we're really seeing the engineering and planning communities really asking the question, as we are building for the future, how do we make sure that we're building to be resilient? Which means that partnering with, you know, large engineering firms for the proper design for what our, you know, future infrastructure is going to need is, you know, the other part of this partnership about working with communities and companies that's kind of critical. And so we're really seeing a large growth and investment by those firms in this sector.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks all of you. This has been a fantastic panel. We appreciate the attention of everyone who was able to dial in. And Jack Schrieben and I will send out an email later today to follow up from this webinar. That concludes our program, and thank you very much for your time.